Hey folks, this is our last review session before exam 3, and we've already done all of the questions from weeks 9, 10, and 11, or at least we've done review sessions for those. But this is just kind of a wrap up review, anything that you want to ask going into this exam, and to help reinforce some key concepts as you're making that final push towards preparing for and taking the exam. Possibly you've even already some people have probably already taken the exam, but I assume if you're watching this, you haven't. And we just had a share from a student of a device to help them remember mimicry. So that mimicry, I'm going to go to ecology and our community ecology section, which is week 11 in our review sheet. And there are two different types of mimicry, and one is Batesian mimicry. And remember, from Batesian mimicry, that's when a harmless species mimics a harmful species, like that little hawk moth caterpillar that I showed you that was just a little caterpillar, but it puffed itself up and it kind of made itself look menacing, and it had a triangle shape actually at its rear end, but it looked like the head of a snake, of a viper. And that was to scare birds away that might want to eat the little caterpillar. So that form of mimicry is Batesian mimicry because the animal is not harmful, but it's pretending to be harmful. And our student, Adriana, comes up with some good stuff here. As said, the way that I remember that is because Batesian has a B and an S in it, and that is just BS from that species that's mimicking the other one. So if you want to use that, you should use that too. Batesian mimicry, BS. It's not really harmful. It's just making you think it is. But Müllerian mimicry is when you do actually have two harmful species, but they've converged on the same either behavioral trait or pattern, coloration, like yellow and black stripes is a really common one. And they're mimicking each other to reinforce the signal to the predator that they are in fact harmful, and they are harmful. Very cool. Awesome. Any questions from the review questions? I haven't seen any. I'm opening up the chat here, but I'm going to go to the review sheets and I'm going to go to our lectures. I want to make sure that everybody is really getting here at the very end these ideas about energy flow, chemical cycling. We addressed that in last week's live lecture review. So if you didn't watch that for week 11, definitely go back and watch that. Some of the things that we didn't quite address as much, I think, would be some speciation. Does anybody want to talk about speciation a little bit more? I'll leave it to you all. Anybody have any specific questions? All right, well, I'm going to go through some key points from weeks 9, 10, and 11. And if specific questions come up, let me know. What do I think is the most challenging from these weeks? With natural selection, it is really important that you understand that process and how natural selection works. So when we have this know and understand and be able to explain Darwin's 3 main observations and 2 inferences, what we're talking about there is that you could tell this as a story to somebody, and you would start with saying, there's a population, and a population is individuals that are all the same species, so they're potentially interbreeding. And within that population, there's variation for a certain trait, and that variation has to have a genetic basis to it. So one thing that you could say is imagine this population where you have rabbits, and the rabbits are all the same species, but some rabbits have darker fur, some rabbits have lighter fur, and there's a range of variation in between. So genetic variation in a population, that's the first observation. The second observation is that there is competition for limited resources, and then the third is differential survival and reproduction. So with my rabbit example, that competition is not so clear to point out. So that one's actually kind of a, yeah, sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But what's really happening is there has to be differential survival and reproduction. And what that means is not every individual has the same likelihood of surviving and reproducing. And the differences are based on those genetic traits. In this case, we're talking about fur color. So we can imagine if these bunnies live in a wooded environment, what fur color is going to be advantageous in a wooded environment? Brown fur or white fur? Yeah, brown fur, right? Because brown fur is going to help them blend into that environment, and they're going to be protected from predation. So there's a selective advantage. The brown bunnies are more likely to survive, therefore they're more likely to reproduce. Now, the two inferences, second part of this is that because of those traits and because of that differential survival in the next generation, what's the population going to look like? How is it going to be different?
More adaptive traits.
In this case, more what color?
Oh, do we say brown?
Yeah, they're going to be darker, right? There's going to be selection for a darker fur color. So the average fur color in the population is going to be darker in the next generation, and that is evolution by natural selection. One problem that an issue that somebody brought up earlier this week was this word adaptation. And you don't want to get confused into thinking that adaptation in this context, in this evolutionary context, means a change over an individual's lifespan. So, for example, if a bunny moved to a different environment where it blends in better, that's not an adaptation, that's a behavior, right? It's not an evolutionary adaptation. Evolutionary adaptations are adaptations that occur at the population level where there's a change in the average trait of the population, and that change over generations is due to certain traits being beneficial and helping individuals survive and reproduce. So make sure you are explaining natural selection to somebody to help you keep these points straight in your head, and make sure you look at the lecture material. I haven't opened up those PDFs, but those PDFs are the slides to help you review all of that.
When it asks like the two components of the theory of evolution, it's the common ancestral species and natural selection.
Right. The two parts of Darwin's theory was that first he said all species today are descended from a single common ancestral species, the first life on Earth. And we know that that first life was probably what kind of organism? What were the first life forms on Earth?
Like a unicellular something.
Yeah, yes, prokaryotes, bacteria, right? Bacterium. And that species, that first life, through this process of evolution, gave rise to all of these different species that we have on Earth today. So that was the first part, that evolution has occurred and that all species alive today are related through ancestry to this one original species. The second part was the mechanism by which evolution occurs, and that was natural selection. And so then you've got those questions, those review questions that are asking you to make sure you know the components of natural selection, the inferences of the observations and the inferences. Okay, here are the two parts. All right. So again, just to make clear, and here it's stated, the observations are that individuals vary, and that's genetic variation, it's heritable variation, and that's within a population. Within a population is an important component of that. It's not across species. And that more individuals are born than can survive and reproduce, that individuals compete for limited resources like food, space, or mates, or sometimes they're just competing for survival in a world where there are threats to them. Right? And that due to their different traits, some individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce in that environment than others. That's the first inference. And over time, as those individuals pass on the adaptive traits in higher proportions, because they're the ones that are reproducing, right? Then the population is going to overall have more of those adaptive traits. You'll see individuals with those adaptive traits being more abundant in the population. Okay. Oh, these really important points about natural selection. Do not forget these. It is not a creative process. You do not get new traits arising because of natural selection. It only works with what's already existing in the population. So there's not going to be a magical trait appearing just because that would be good in the population. That's not how natural selection works. It doesn't create new traits. It's also not goal oriented. So you can't say that there is a perfect trait for a species, because if the environment changes, then the trait that would be good might be a different kind of trait, because it's all within an environmental context. So we sometimes have this idea that evolution over the course of the history of the earth is just this march toward progress. But actually, you have very simple life forms that are thriving on Earth right now. I mean, we still have bacteria 3.8 billion years later, and that's because they're very successful at what they do. So there's no goal in natural selection, but the individuals that have the trait that's best in that scenario are more likely to pass on their genes. So that's why that kind of trait becomes more common in future generations. I've got sexual selection here. Make sure you know these different types of sexual selection, what they mean. Intrasexual competition versus intersexual choice. Make sure you know what sexual dimorphism is, that it's within a species, and that within that species, males and females look very different from each other. You could easily tell a male from a female based on something like their size or how decorated they are, in the case of birds. And we had some evidence for evolution, but we're going to come back to some of this more when we talk about how do you know how closely related species are evolutionarily. And that was in our lecture on systematics and taxonomy, phylogenetics. So I'm going to go on to that next one. Ooh, population genetics. This is where we go into the different kinds of evolution, or the different causes of evolution, right? Evolution is a change in the gene frequencies or the genetic makeup of a population over time. And we know that natural selection is one way that you can get evolution, and that's what Darwin proposed. But post-Darwin, we also know there are multiple other ways that populations can evolve. So does anybody want to throw out some of those other potential ways that populations can evolve? Causes of evolution. Okay.
Or I was going to say gene flow mutations.
Gene flow, yes. So gene flow, transferring alleles between populations. That's a way that populations can evolve. Mutation, absolutely. If a new allele arises in a population, that is a form of evolution because it changes the population's gene pool. Good. Awesome. And genetic drift, which is those changes in the gene pool due to randomness or chance. So we've got natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutations. And those can all lead to evolution in a population.
Oh, is sexual
Mhm.
selection part of it also?
Yeah, sexual selection, it often gets clumped together with natural selection, but yes, sexual selection leads to evolution. That's how you get elephant seal males that are so big because of
Mhm.
sexual selection. It's how you get peacock males that are so decorated and fancy because of sexual selection.
And is there like a specific order to it that we have to like memorize it, or is it just whichever one we
There's no
know?
specific order. It's just any
Okay.
of these things could be happening to cause a population to evolve.
Okay,
Doesn't
makes
have to
sense.
be natural selection, right? It could just be randomness and genetic drift, especially if the population's very small. Like you see,
Okay.
a lot of times we see populations on islands that are very small, and they end up having different traits on the whole as the population because of the effects of just randomness in which traits get passed on and which don't. And that's genetic drift. It's not natural selection.
Okay, makes sense.
And there's no order to them. So great, that's a great question. Even though I numbered them, they're just all different ways in which populations can evolve. And we have our two sources of variation in the populations. And the initial source of variation, the ultimate source of variation, again, is mutations, right? Mutations are what lead to new alleles. And we know from our genetics lessons that alleles are alternative versions of genes. And what makes me different from you and you different from everybody else is that we don't all have the same alleles and we have different combinations of alleles, but we get the creation of new alleles through mutation. And that's the initial source of genetic variation. It's just a change in the DNA sequence, and that gives a new allele. Those mutations are not targeted, they're not goal oriented, they are random changes in DNA sequences. So most mutations are not good, all right? Most mutations aren't going to give you some trait that's amazing like Spider-Man. But occasionally, occasionally, if you just randomly change something, something good's going to come out of it. And that can happen when you have billions of years of evolution. You have all of these mutations, and sometimes you get this really useful allele out of it. Okay, variation. And we did go over all of this in our week 9 lecture review. So I think we're good there. The pre-zygotic barriers, the post-zygotic barriers. And then in the next week, we got into speciation and classification. I want to go there and look at week 10. And I hope you're looking at your review sheet right now and looking at all these questions and saying, yep, okay, just reinforcing this information. You've watched the lectures, you've written down the answers on the review sheet. Now let's do some reinforcing. Going back. Speciation. What are the two types of speciation? Oh, this is a different. Wait. All right, just a sec. What were the two different types of speciation?
Allopatric and sympatric.
Yeah, so we had allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And of those two, which is the most common type of speciation?
Allopatric?
Yeah, definitely allopatric. Good. And what does allopatric speciation require that sympatric speciation does not require?
To be isolated from each other, right?
Right. So that requires geographic isolation. So these, in order for allopatric speciation to occur, populations have to be isolated. So let's look at that. Okay, what happens when these populations get isolated from each other? If you isolate a population, what process cannot happen anymore?
Like they can't mate with each other?
They can't mate with each other, right? So they're not having any exchange of genes. There's no gene flow to this isolated population. So that becomes its own separate entity. So you have an isolated population. That's the first step in allopatric speciation. Geographically isolated, right? They're not in the same area. They cannot come into contact with each other. And then once they're isolated, these two populations that are now isolated from each other evolve differently. This is often like a mainland population, like we'd have here in Santa Barbara, versus an island population when a few foxes from the mainland got stuck out on the Channel Islands. And now they're going to evolve differently from the other population. Why would they evolve differently?
Random chance?
Could be, right? It could be just genetic drift because they're a small population. So there's just a random chance. Okay. Could be due to.
Don't they have to
Could-
like adapt to the new environments or
Right.
environment?
Exactly. Yeah. They're experiencing different environments. So natural selection could act differently on these different populations now. Like maybe one trait is advantageous in one population, different traits advantageous in the other. And also there could be mutations that arise. A mutation can arise in one population and not the other. So there are various reasons why these populations might evolve differently. And what's going to be necessary in order for speciation to take place is that they are so different from each other genetically over a certain period of time that if you put them back together in the same place, they would not be able to mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. So that's what we mean by this step 3. Changes in the gene pools lead to reproductive barriers. Okay. And the example that I gave in lecture was the desert pupfish in Death Valley. Some of the little pools that became isolated when Death Valley dried out, some of the pools are saltier than others. Some of the pools have predators and others don't. Some of them are clearer water and therefore bright colors and sexual selection might become more of an issue there. So they're under different selective pressures in these isolated pools and they've evolved into different species. Cool. All right. I think understanding allopatric speciation is really, really important. And sympatric speciation, I definitely went over a lot in the review for week 10, correct? Do you all remember that? I think that one was covered pretty heavily. It's just when the populations are not isolated, they're overlapping in space. They're in the same area, but they might start using the resources differently, like using a different host plant in the case of these hawthorn maggot flies and apple maggot flies. And then because they are using different host plants, they're evolving differently and they have different selective pressures and they become genetically distinct. What they start off with, this is in speaking about species and biologically, we call them distinct races or distinct subspecies. And that's something where we can look at the genetics and we can say, oh, that's definitely an apple maggot fly, or that's definitely a hawthorn maggot fly, based on these genetic markers that are unique to those different subspecies. All right. Classification. And then you want to make sure that you understand how to write scientific names correctly, that you always have that first part capitalized, the second part lowercase, and the scientific name must be either italicized or underlined. And if it's underlined, both parts are underlined separately. So it's not correct unless all of those conditions are met. All right, your classification hierarchy. Dear, I don't know. I always said dear King Philip came over for good soup. I don't know if that one's useful to you all, but maybe you could find something more relatable in your life. Come up with your own device. And then we have these phylogenies. And we talked about this in our lab when we studied lizards. We also talked about it in a review here, that you should be able to look at a phylogenetic tree and you should be able to, based on this phylogenetic tree, clearly identify which species are most closely related to each other evolutionarily. So which two species on this tree are the closest evolutionary relatives to each other?
The coyote and the wolf.
Mm-hmm.
Does the
Yeah.
length, like to the node, indicate an amount of time, or is it just the graphic?
That is exactly what is indicating the amount of time. So
Okay.
on this phylogeny, and it's not to scale, right? But what we can deduce is relative time here, which means that this is the furthest back in time. There was a common ancestor to all of these species. These species are still on Earth and they're out here today, right? They're here today. This was the common ancestor to all of these. And at some point in the distant past, that branched. There's speciation that gave rise to two different lineages. One of them became the cat lineage. The other one became the lineage that gave rise to the mustelids and the dogs. And then as we move forward in time, so back here's the furthest amount of time, here's present day. Yes, the distance back of this branching point indicates how recent those separated from each other, how recently. So the reason you would say that the coyote and the wolf are the most close relatives to each other, the closest relatives evolutionarily, is because this branching point is not as far back as these other branching points here. So is a striped skunk more closely related to a domestic cat or to a wolf? Which one of those is more closely related to a skunk, the cat or the wolf?
The wolf.
Yes, the wolf, yeah. And if you're just looking out here, then you might think, oh, well, the skunk's right beside the cat, so they're closely related, but they're not. You have to look at the branching pattern and see that you have to go all the way back to here to find the common ancestor to the cat and the skunk. But you only need to go back this far to right here to find the common ancestor of the skunk and the wolf. And then if the phylogenetic trees are made accurately, what they should do is also give you a way to classify your species as being in the same genus, for example, or being in the same family, or being in the same order. And we call these nested clades within a phylogenetic tree. You wouldn't say that this otter and this coyote are in the same genus unless these other species are also in that same genus, because they're not more closely related to each other than they are to the skunk and the wolf, respectively. So the phylogeny sets up the classification. That's how it should work. Like, you should get the phylogeny first, which is the true relationship, and then base your classification off of that. And then you've got, how do we know how closely related things are? How do we make this phylogenetic tree? And that is where all of these tools come in. The fossil record, homologous structures, not to be confused with analogous structures, which are due to convergent evolution, but homologous structures, and this is why it's hard to use homologous structures, these are the ones that are due to common ancestry. So if you look at the bone arrangement in the forelimbs of humans, cats, whales, and bats, we have essentially the same bone arrangement, even though we use those limbs to do very different things. And that's because we have a shared mammalian mammal ancestor that had that bone arrangement. So that's a good example of homologous structures actually working out for us. But since we have to be so concerned about convergent evolution here, what do you think is the best way to establish a phylogeny, excuse me? What should we base our phylogenies on ultimately? The thing that is the most reliable is DNA. So if we can have DNA sequences of all of the species that we're looking at, and that's not easy, right? And it's getting cheaper and cheaper, it's getting easier and easier, but it's definitely been very expensive and prohibitive in the past. But if we can look at DNA sequences and we can compare those DNA sequences, that's the molecular biology, right? Comparing DNA or proteins. That will enable us to construct this phylogeny that is probably the most accurate depiction of the history of relationships in that group. All right. I have to run to go to a meeting in just a couple of minutes. I have another meeting at 3, but I do want to make sure that everybody knows that we had a review last week, and that review is posted. It's in the live lecture review section of the week 11 module. And in that review, we talked about energy flow and chemical cycling. These concepts are really, really important. It's important to understand why energy transfer up through the various levels of the trophic pyramid is inefficient, that only 10% is passed up each time you move to a different level. And how is that relevant to our diets as humans? We saw that in our ecological footprints this week. I think a lot of people really got the message when they saw that they were answering questions about what they eat in the ecological footprint, and that the more meat we consume, the bigger our ecological footprint. And that is because of this energy transfer and the lost energy with every step. So the higher up we are on that pyramid, the less efficiently we are using the resources. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, we'll go back and look at those other reviews and hammer away at these concepts, play things at twice the speed if you want. I've heard I sound really, really funny at 2 times the speed. I always play things at 1.25 and then go back to the parts that I feel like I need more help with. I hope you all do great on this exam. I hope it's a good one for you and that you feel prepared. And we do have Maddie has tutor hours on Friday. There aren't any tutor hours tomorrow on Thursday. Happy Veterans Day. Take some time to acknowledge the veterans and thank the veterans that you know for their service. And I hope that we really will be able to take that time tomorrow on Veterans Day to think about what that day is all about and check in with veterans in our lives. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.